as we know from our study of the American Revolution, the central issue, that which defined us as a country, defined the very genesis of the United States, was the issue of the power in government. And that issue is played out with the Articles of Confederation. What you see when we set up the United States of America as its own independent sovereign nation is that issue of how much power should go to that federal government. Now, we realized that when we declared our independence from England, we were 13 sovereign nations. And so the first thing that happened is we created constitutions of 13 independent sovereign states, independent sovereign nations. And you see one of them there, that the constitutions of the individual states limited the power of government extraordinarily. We had thrown off the strong central government of England, and we wanted power to reside in government only at the state and local level. And even then, the constitutions were limited in the power it gave to government. Government is tyranny, and that is a yoke under which I will not live. The two-house assembly was commonplace. It had been in practice during the colonial and revolutionary years, and many of those states went to that which was a Bill of Rights. The Second Continental Congress, at the time the states are declaring themselves sovereign independent nations, is trying to put together a form of government for the nation as a whole. We declare ourselves united, we declare ourselves to be independent as a nation, yet we're trying to create that whole, that nation that's there. The Second Continental Congress puts forward what is called the Articles of Confederation. To confederate 13 separate nations into one nation is put forward. And the dates of that putting forth of a national constitution are that the Second Continental Congress in 1779 puts forward the Articles of Confederation. In 1781, they are ratified by the 13 sovereign nations. We have a federal government, and in 1783, we win the war against England, and we are recognized by the world as being our sovereign nation. The ratification process was not difficult and actually good. The concept, therefore, becomes how much power should we give, especially at a time in which we're facing enormous difficulties as sovereign nations. The power and structure of our government is very simple under the Articles of Confederation. There is no executive. There's no executive branch. We do not want a tyrant. We do not want central government power. We set up a structure that also was inherently not very functioning, not very able to function. We set up a unicameral legislature on the national level, one house. And that unicameral legislature has to ratify, has to agree by 2/3 on any piece of legislation that goes forward. There is no executive branch. There is no judicial branch. There is a legislative branch with a unicameral legislature that has to have 2/3 of its members, 9 of the 13 states. Yes, one representative per state got to vote at the Articles of Confederation. So we set up a structure that is not very government-like, not very efficient in its use. And we limit its powers. And the power we limit it to is the fact that it doesn't get to do much at all. It cannot tax. It has to ask for voluntary donations from the states. There is no executive to run a military to deal with foreign problems. And it cannot regulate interstate commerce. It can't regulate the commerce of the nation. It is inherently and purposefully weak in its orientation and its nature. Now, we faced with enormous difficulties at the time, too. There's enormous inflation from war. As we will study U.S. history, wartime causes prices to rise, and inflation is the result. In addition, it can't tax, so there's no money for the federal government, and it can't regulate commerce, as I said. It is enormously weak in its structure, which makes a lot of people, especially the radical revolutionaries, very happy. So what happens is that we do not deal with the problems facing the nation. Spain is taking over the Mississippi. England will not remove itself from the forts on our frontier. And Native Americans literally are beating the daylights out of us out there on the frontier, with only state militias being able to stop them in any way. So this new government, this new nation from 1783 for the next several years, is having extraordinary difficulties. Thus, the emblematic thing that represents the problem is Shays' Rebellion. What you have is a reaction against the government not providing for the needs of the people. You have a rebellion out on the frontier, and you have a federal government in 1787 that is totally unable to deal with backcountry hard scrabble rabble who don't want federal government, yet are not happy with what the government's treating them. And the federal government fails in every way to deal with this revolution, this rebellion, this uprising within the nation. Many people, including those who went to the Annapolis Convention in 1786, were calling for a stronger government. Many people, including George Washington, said that the horrid specter of anarchy is upon our country. We are going to fall apart. And that's the basis for the coming together of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to redo the Articles of Confederation. Well, if it in structure is not powerful, and if it's in power not powerful, it can't regulate commerce, it can't deal with foreign affairs, it can't tax. What did it do well? And the Articles of Confederation did do one thing well, and that's in Western lands. They looked west and they said, oh, each of the 13 states claims to the western Mississippi, to the west to Mississippi. What each of those states was willing and able to do was give up that western land for the Articles of Confederation government. So the western lands are given up and given over to the federal government. Now the federal government has western lands in its possession. What will you do with those western lands? Well, the Land Ordinance of 1785 was brilliant, because it said that western land would be surveyed, divided up into townships, and it would provide for the rational and orderly process of selling that land to settlers coming out. No more hard scrabble rabble, no more fights over who owns what land. There was a rational and orderly process for the surveying and sale of western lands. Brilliantly done in 1785 by the Articles of Confederation Congress. The other thing it did was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And this was an orderly, rational process for the surveying and development of territories out west. Each of the different places out west, be it Ohio or Kentucky or Tennessee or eventually Indiana and Illinois in the Northwest Territory, would have to eventually come into the Union in some way. Would they stay a permanent colony? Would they come in as a subset, not an actual state, but something below that? And what we had was that rational and orderly process for it to become a territory governed well by the federal government with a governor and a military leader and a justice of the peace. And then eventually, when the population got sufficient, it would petition with a written constitution to come into the United States of America. That written constitution would be ratified, accepted by the United States Congress. It was brilliantly done. So we not only have an orderly settlement of, but incorporation of those western lands into the nation. And the final brilliant thing it did was to ban slavery. That Northwest Territory would not allow slavery. And that was the key ingredient to get white men to go out west to settle in that Northwest Territory. So incredible failure. The Articles of Confederation did not, in fact, work. It did do certain things well with the western land. And by 1787, we are scared out of our wits that we might fall apart as a country. And we call a constitutional convention in that hot summer of 1787 to rectify the problem.